On this episode of Stormwater Talk, we'll be speaking with Mark Goodson, who is the Planning and Resiliency Practice Lead for CSRS. Mark is a member of the project team for the East Baton Rouge Parish Stormwater Master Plan and has a career that spans over 15 years. During that time, he focuses on resilience work, urban planning and development, public finance, budgeting, and program management. We look forward to what Mark is going to share with us on this episode. Greetings and thank you for listening to this episode of Stormwater Talk. My name is Jonathan Hill, and I'm responsible for communications and outreach for the East Baton Rouge Parish Stormwater Master Plan. This is a production of the East Baton Rouge Parish Stormwater Master Plan, Franklin Associates, and I'm joined here with my producer today, Christina Lacroix. The East Baton Rouge Parish Stormwater Master Plan and 20-year capital improvement plan seeks to identify flood-related risk, vulnerabilities, and recommend capital improvements to mitigate or reverse those risks. And to find out more about the Stormwater Master Plan, you can visit stormwater.brla.gov. You can also follow on social media at StormwaterEBR. So, Mark, thank you for joining us here with Mark Goodson. Mark, why don't you just take a moment to introduce yourself to the audience and tell us a little bit about your background and how you got involved in this work?
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. Mark Goodson, I'm with CSRS. We are a planning and design and program management consulting firm based in Louisiana. My personal background is I'm a landscape architect by education. I've spent much of my career in local government, really centered around implementation of public projects. A big part of that is making sure that the rules are in place to make those projects successful, which is what drew my interest to the development of codes and ordinances and policies that guide, how projects get implemented and ultimately the outcomes that they can provide to the community. And so our role on the East Baton Rouge Stormwater Master Plan, in part, is to help strengthen the codes and ordinances for the parish to produce better outcomes, namely reduced flood risk.
So you mentioned those codes and ordinances for the parish as a part of the East Baton Rouge Stormwater Master Plan. And so if you could define, just for the listening audience, what are codes and ordinances at a very, practical level for our audience?
Sure. In the simplest terms, codes and ordinances are the rules by which in this case, city-parish operate. As it relates to the Stormwater Master Plan, it's really about the rules that govern how development and infrastructure projects get planned, selected, designed, and built.
And so as with any rules, those have to be adjusted and sometimes tweaked over time based off things that happen in just life changing, culture changing, and even how developments come about changing. And so what are some of the potential changes that the Stormwater Master Plan is looking at as it relates to codes and ordinances for East Baton Rouge Parish?
Let me first say that, and this is not unique to East Baton Rouge Parish, but a lot of the development codes and ordinances here and across the country were written 30, 40, 50 years ago when community values were different, when the demands for things like transportation were different, and when our climate patterns were different. And so, as you suggested, we have to adapt with the times, and that includes adapting the rules. If we want to be a safe and prosperous community, we need to change our rules to make sure that they're keeping up with and hopefully even looking to the future in terms of what the needs and demands and values of the community may be. So, again, establishing that the East Baton Rouge Stormwater Master Plan, first and foremost, is about reducing flood risk for the parish. We want to look at how we can improve codes and ordinances, i.e. the rules, for developments, real estate developments in particular, that make them reduce the impact that they may have on flood risk, manage stormwater better. And that can range from, where development can or should occur to how it should be designed and built to limit the impacts that it can have on the development of the people that use it itself, but also on the surrounding properties.
And so one of the proposed changes has been around a stormwater conveyance check. Can you speak a little bit about that and why that's being proposed, why you feel that's important?
Sure. It sounds like a really technical thing, and it is, but in general, the conveyance check is a tool that will allow the city-parish to evaluate how a potential development project might change the way that water flows through it or around it, and how that change in the flow of water, conveyance, impacts the surrounding properties. So, not that this would ever happen, but if someone were to buy a lot and decide they want to fill the lot with 6 feet from end to end of new dirt and then build on top of that, that's going to change the natural drainage patterns. That's going to change the way that water moves around that property. If it's 6 feet higher than everything around it, that water is going to flow around it as opposed to through it. And therefore, it's going to put more water flowing through the surrounding properties, which may have a negative impact on those properties. That's what we're checking for in this conveyance check, is to see what impact a development project may have on that flow of water. And then it allows the city-parish to suggest changes or give the developer or designer the opportunity to suggest changes to mitigate for that.
And so just to be clear, these changes that I'm referencing, these are still proposed, or have they been codified into statute yet?
The conveyance check was adopted last year in 2021.
Okay.
We have an additional set of recommendations that will be coming forward in 22 that will add additional enhancements to the codes and ordinances. But the conveyance check is codified.
Okay. And so there were several in 2021 that were somewhat tagged as interim changes, and I want to talk through those, one of them being the stormwater conveyance check. The next one was the green infrastructure prioritization. Green infrastructure has been, I don't want to say a buzzword, but has been researched a lot across the nation. We see it coming up specifically a whole lot on transportation projects, but there are even some local commercial developments who understand the importance of it and are putting it as a part of their site plan. And so how does this play a factor into the stormwater master plan and the codes and ordinances that are being proposed?
Let me quickly define green infrastructure.
Yeah, that's good.
It is recapturing or reintroducing natural functions into infrastructure, in particular how nature deals with water. If water were to run across what is an undeveloped and natural area, it's going to perform differently. Where the trees may help soak it up, it will infiltrate, in the ground. Much of it will be absorbed that way, as opposed to, let's say, a 100% paved parking lot, where the water is going to quickly run off into a drain and then shoot into a ditch or a channel. So by introducing green infrastructure into new development, you are helping to better manage the water by using some of those natural functions, whether it's trees, whether it's bioswales, which are essentially man-made little mini wetlands that help to slow down the flow of water, depending on what plant materials you use. They can clean some of the particulates that may be in the water, runoff from the neighboring or surrounding area. And they can actually be used for detention to hold water, to slow it down so that it doesn't inundate the drainage systems and create stormwater flooding issues. With all that said, the green infrastructure interim changes that were adopted in 2021 focused at this point strictly on the transportation elements of development, primarily because those are the biggest culprits in that they are mostly, impervious surface, asphalt, concrete. We're talking about roads, driveways, parking lots. And what the green infrastructure prioritization ordinance language does is it requires developers to look for opportunities to incorporate green infrastructure. It gives a number of suggestions for how they might do that. And essentially, if they find that it's not feasible for them to do that, they have to prove why. In a perfect world, every new development would incorporate green infrastructure and natural features in some way. It's just a better, more responsible, more sustainable way to manage stormwater from both a flood risk reduction and a water quality perspective. This now at least makes, for lack of a better way to put it, it makes developers make a good faith effort to incorporate that into the transportation components of the projects.
So based off your experience and knowledge of green infrastructure, is there a certain level of green infrastructure that should be ideal for a certain size development? Is there any correlation, or is it just a good faith effort?
There's lots of different literature out there and different methodologies to determine that. It's generally, I guess, adopted that there's a ratio of impervious to pervious surface to green infrastructure to hard surface that's most appropriate, and what the new green infrastructure codes include are the methodology for how you determine that. So you have to, based on the capture area size, you have to determine what your priority areas are within the development site for placing green infrastructure and what that might look like.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for that. So another one that has been referenced is the minimum slab of base flood elevation, sometimes known as the BFE, that one must have. Can you speak to us a little bit about the potential change, the intended benefit of that?
Yes. When we talk about base flood elevation requirements, generally we're talking about how much higher a building needs to be relative to the 100-year floodplain that's established by the federal government, by FEMA. What we've learned over the past decade or more is that due to new developments and the changing landscape, even a changing climate, that FEMA established baseline, that 100-year base flood elevation, isn't always accurate. And so, and it's contextual. What is established as the BFE in one part of town might not be appropriate for another part of town due to its flood risk exposure. And so what we're looking at through these new codes and ordinances recommendations is using the best scientific modeling that we have out there, running models based on current and future rainfall conditions and development scenarios to determine what is the best base flood elevation or minimum slab elevation. Is it still currently in East Baton Rouge Parish, it's 1 foot above the base flood elevation, the 100-year floodplain. Is that still the appropriate BFE or minimum slab elevation? Should it be something more? Should it be something less? Should we establish zones where it's different, where it fluctuates depending on the flood risk for that area? We've got the technology now to be able to determine that. And because of the investment that the city-parish is making, we can be sort of ahead of the curve in terms of when FEMA might come back and update the 100-year floodplain. And so it just makes more sense to be proactive and look at it with the new models that we have to determine, what is the safe elevation that buildings should be built at or built to.
Awesome. And so one of the final ones, I think there's one more we'll reference, is this preservation or protecting of natural floodplain features. That, as you've already referenced, that water has somewhat of its own natural flow. And oftentimes, I shouldn't say oftentimes, but development does change that flow. But here we're talking about protecting many of the natural features or the natural piece of land and how water flows. What's some of that intended benefit for that?
Let me give a quick background, and then I'll
Yeah,
elaborate more.
You're the expert here. That's what we want.
Notwithstanding all the development that has happened in East Baton Rouge Parish over the last however many years, there are still some natural areas and natural riparian or stream corridors. But generally speaking, and again, this isn't unique to Baton Rouge, as development has happened in our cities, we have sought to make water move as quickly as possible so as to get it off of one property and send it somewhere else. And so we have, in many cases, straightened our streams. We've done things like line them with concrete or change the shape of the channel itself so that they are really meant to transport as much water as quickly as possible. Likewise, with development, whereas, before the last few years in particular, there just wasn't the sort of the public consciousness that we have today. Most developments were designed in the same way, to get water off of my property and into whatever the closest drainage system was to send it away somewhere else. What we learned, especially in the great floods of 2016, is that comes with a price, and that if that's somewhere else, that place downstream where we're sending that water doesn't have the capacity to handle all of it, it starts to back up, which results in flooding. It also contributes to some water quality issues. Again, where we mentioned, plant material, even soils in their natural state help to clean water as it runs over an area, flows over an area. If it's flowing straight off of a rooftop or a concrete parking lot into a concrete or cast iron drain pipe and moving as fast as possible, it doesn't have the opportunity to clean out those nutrients and particulates. So the reason to conserve as much and preserve as much natural area as we can is just for that, to maintain those natural functions that handle water as God intended. Also, there's a lot of those natural areas, particularly those low-lying areas, they hold a lot of water in heavy rain events. And so when we develop right up next to them, when we change the way water moves and the capacity that those areas have to hold water, it shifts it somewhere else that may not be prepared to handle it. And so, we want to maintain as much natural water storage capacity as we have, as well as we want to maintain as much natural conveyance as we have to slow down water, to clean it, and to be able to store it in heavy rain events so that it doesn't inundate somewhere else where we have people and structures.
So you mentioned something interesting there about low-lying areas and water being held there. And so as individuals would travel throughout, oftentimes the city parish, and see an area with water and looks like it could be there for an extended period of time, depending on the rain event, you're saying that there are certain instances where it's designed to do that. That's its natural function. And oftentimes, as a resident, we're trying to figure out, why is that water still there? But it's there because it's supposed to be there.
That's right.
Is there an image of that in the within East Baton Rouge Parish that you can speak of that's designed specifically like that?
Sure. I'll give you two really good ones. They're both in South Baton Rouge, so forgive me for not having a North Baton Rouge example immediately available. But there are two parks, Highland Road Park and the Burbank Soccer Complex, both of which are tremendous green infrastructure assets that many people may not realize. If you were to drive past Highland Road Park, in particular the ball fields where it backs up to Bayou Fountain, or the Burbank Soccer Complex, after a heavy rain, those areas may hold water for a number of hours, maybe even a number of days if it's a really heavy rain event. But those are low-lying areas. They're recreational areas that are designed to maintain that natural storage capacity. We did a study for the East Baton Rouge Parks and Recreation Commission a couple of years ago after the 2016 flood. And I don't have the exact figures off the top of my head, but their parks held something to along the lines of 19 billion gallons of stormwater in the 2016 flood.
Wow.
Enough to fill Tiger Stadium like 60 times. That's taking advantage of the natural functions of low-lying areas as opposed to filling them or paving them or doing something else that would otherwise send the water somewhere else. That's water that, if those areas were developed, would have ended up in somebody else's yard or in someone else's home. So, those are two, I think, really good examples of green infrastructure and maintaining that natural storage capacity.
Great. Thank you for that. And I guess the last one we were mentioned on what were tagged as the interim changes were, some clarifications to Chapter 15 of the Unified Development Code, or UDC. That is the governing, I guess you would say, document for codes and developments for the parish. Just at a very, high level, those technical changes that were kind of incorporated in there, if you can speak to those.
Sure. Going back to my definition that codes and ordinances are the rules for how a city operates, the Unified Development Code, or UDC, in East Baton Rouge is the rule book for how the development of land should occur. And there were, while overall it's a fantastic rule book, there was some language that was more ambiguous, that just needed some more, some technical tweaks to give, in particular, land developers, real estate developers, more predictability and just a clearer understanding of what the rules are and what they need to do to abide by those rules. And likewise, it allows the parish to be able to clearly enforce those rules. So there was a number of what I would consider small kind of technical nits, but overall, it just helped clarify what the intent of the rules were and how to better follow or enforce those rules.
And so what's next, right? So we've talked about some of these interim changes, and I believe these have been adopted. Am I correct?
That's correct, with the exception of the minimum slab elevation, base flood elevation. That's being considered for the next round of recommendations.
Okay. And so kind of as you think, what's next? Are there any future projections that you can speak to as it relates to future changes for codes and ordinances?
Sure. Well, I can tell you what we're looking at. Yeah. As it relates to preserving natural areas and the natural functions of the floodplain, we're looking at some tools that really are best practices that have been used in other places, particularly those with similar climates and topography to East Baton Rouge Parish. Stream setbacks, preserving that natural stream or riparian corridor for all the reasons I mentioned before. There's a way to do that we believe is fair to the landowners, but also preserves that critical function of that stream, the critical natural function of that stream, and protects its ability to better manage water while still allowing the property to be usable and developable in many cases by the owner. That's one we're looking at. Another is establishing what we're calling conveyance zones. They're areas that may not show up if you were to look at the FEMA floodplain maps or the FEMA floodway maps, but they're areas that through our modeling, our collective stormwater master plan team's modeling, have determined are at high risk or could in the future be at high risk for flooding. And those are areas where we need stricter development rules, really to discourage the development in those low-lying areas. But if folks who own the property do want to develop, then they need to do so responsibly and in a way that doesn't negatively impact the land around them. We're also looking at expanding the green infrastructure language beyond just the transportation components to more of a complete site design methodology, and looking at the standards for how sites should be designed relative to how new development sites, that is, manage and capture stormwater on site before sending it into, drainage systems.
And so as we talked about kind of what is currently taking place interimly, things that have been approved, things that are on the horizon, what is the process to get these codes and ordinances approved, and who can even make recommendations for potential changes, even as we talked about constantly adopting or being on the cutting edge for the future?
Sure. The master plan itself and the master planning process has really employed a robust community engagement strategy, and there's a great website for the Stormwater Master Plan that's a resource for folks to see what's been done, what's being done, and provide their comments. Specific to these codes and ordinances, our team is doing what I would consider the technical work to develop these recommendations based on the data and the expertise that our team has. We will then run our recommendations through a policy committee that's been established by the city-parish. It represents neighborhood associations, the development sector, development community, design professionals, to get their input. This has to be a conversation about, how do we manage risk, but also what's our acceptable level of risk? How far are we willing to go to manage that risk? And there are cost implications. There are also, there are land use implications, and there are risk implications to that. So, the recommendations are really a starting point. And then using that policy group as a sounding board, we'll continue to shape and refine those codes and ordinance recommendations based on the feedback that we get. The next step will then be to vet those, through the broader community, through the master plan community engagement team, and ultimately they'll hopefully be presented to the city parish administration and the planning commission and metro council for review and adoption in a public meeting, as they always are. So there are multiple sort of points at which an East Baton Rouge Parish resident / stakeholder can review and provide feedback on what will be forthcoming in terms of the recommendations.
Thank you for that. That website he referenced, that's stormwater.brla.gov for more information on the Stormwater Master Plan in general, but also there's a section on there as it relates to codes and ordinances. And so as we come to the conclusion of our time, one or two more things, Mark, I want to ask you to share with our audience. This work has been taking place for several years now. And that website I referenced, you can find information on how even back to 2017, there have been some adjustments to codes and ordinances. And so as we look at that, have we seen any impact from them that have taken place over the past 3 or 4 years? Any benefit from some of the slow incremental changes that we've seen here for the parish?
That's a great question. I don't know that any of it has been measured or quantified specifically, but anecdotally, we are, and through just the development review process, we're seeing projects come forward that are adhering to what I'll still call new requirements that have been implemented since 2017 relative to how much water needs to be captured on site, and reducing or eliminating the runoff from new development projects onto their neighbors. And over the last several years, I think that has really changed the expectation of the development community. Not that they came into this conversation kicking and screaming, but they've been playing by the rules. And as you change the rules, they have to adapt as well. That doesn't necessarily happen overnight. And so we've seen, the development community come along with those requirements. We would expect that the same will happen, as we further sort of strengthen the codes and ordinances relative to flood risk. I think you would also find, and this is sort of more on the softer benefits side, but I think you will find if you were to drive through recent development projects in Baton Rouge, we're getting overall a better quality of development just by nature of them needing to perform differently, better, I would argue, in terms of how they manage stormwater. You're seeing more green infrastructure. In detention ponds, in planting strips, in open space, in street trees, in the conservation of natural areas that are incorporated into the planning and design of new developments. Even today, I think even the resident or potential prospective resident, their taste has changed. They're seeing the value, whether they see it from a stormwater management perspective or not. They see the value of, a natural area or a green space as part of their neighborhood or community that they can use and enjoy. It just also happens to provide a lot of other benefits, relative to stormwater management. So that was a long-winded answer. It's coming along. I think we're getting a better quality of development, and it's helping to reduce flood risk. The challenge is we have a long way to go to sort of catch up to where we are now from a condition standpoint, an environmental condition standpoint, and we'll need to continue to adapt over time as conditions change.
So any final thoughts or words you want to leave with our audience for this episode as it relates to your work in the Stormwater Master Plan?
I would just say, none of this stormwater master planning effort or the capital projects that are required to improve our drainage and flood risk reduction in East Baton Rouge Parish are happening as fast as anyone would like them to. There are a number of reasons for that, not the least of which is, much of this is supported by federal funding that just is slow to move and sort of requires a very deliberate process that must be followed. All that being said, I think what the end result of this master plan is going to be will be cutting edge for Louisiana, and the data and the science behind it is going to be some of the best, if not the best, in the state. And so I hope that East Baton Rouge residents can embrace that and really be proud of what ultimately our city-parish is doing to help reduce their risk. Also, we all can play a role individually in reducing flood risk, and education is a big component to this master plan or master planning process. And so it doesn't stop with just better codes and ordinances. It doesn't stop with new flood risk reduction or drainage projects. Every resident can play a part in that, in how they choose to manage stormwater at their own property. What materials they use for their homes or buildings, for their driveways and parking lots. If you have a ditch, for example, that runs through your property, if you maintain that and keep it clean and free of obstructions, you're helping the flow of water through your property and not backing it up or passing it on. There are little things that we can all do to help reduce flood risk, and I think this master plan process is heightening that awareness, but I hope that more residents will seek to sort of do their part in the process as well.
So you've left us with a lot of food for thought, and on a good note that each of us can be our own stormwater manager.
There you go. As
it relates to the properties that we are responsible for here in the parish. Well, Mark, thank you for joining us for this episode of Stormwater Talk. Definitely look forward to having you here back with us in the future again to talk more about the Stormwater Master Plan and the codes and ordinances.
Thanks for having me.
To find out more about the Stormwater Master Plan, you can visit stormwater.brla.gov. You can also follow on social media at StormwaterEBR.